a regularity, a mathematical regularity of both form, of syllable, and of emphasis. That itself, right, becomes a new form of poiesis. A poiesis that doesn't just simply speak out of being, or speak of the nothing, or is a work of art, but rather is regulated. And you can see that even poetical thinkers recognize this. A good example is Nietzsche in I want to say Twilight of Idols. It's in one of his aphoristic works. What he points out that for the ancient Greeks, that form was not a chain. Or rather, it was a chain that you restrained yourself through form, i.e. the mathematical, but in doing so, you proved your skill and strength. So Nietzsche, right, the aesthetician par excellence, right, also recognizes this sort of mathematical interruption of poetics. So it's important to note that Badiou is not just making wild assertion here, but there's a long history behind this. So now we're left with a real question, right? Because for Heidegger, nature is that thing that, or physis, right, is that thing that shows itself in its own most. So what happens is Badiou raises the question whether or not the concept of nature has any place in the ontology of the multiple. And he finds, as Heidegger, that the natural is that which comes to stand in itself. This is 126 to 127. And I'd like to just go over it really quick. Let's see. Thus being, though, and this is the second full paragraph on 127. Thus being, though as physis, is the stability of maintaining itself there, the consistency, the equilibrium which maintains itself in the opening force of a limit. If we retain this concept of nature, we will say that a pure multiple is natural if it attests to the form multiple itself, and that a pure multiple is natural if it, a particular consistency, a specific manner of holding together, a natural multiple is a superior form of internal cohesion to the multiple. So what happens here is he begins to formulate nature, but what's important is, unlike Heidegger, right, for Heidegger the unnatural, right, shows us, except for man in and of itself, right, the unnatural is usually a pathology, a disruption, a cut between the ontological and the ontic. In other words, it is something inauthentic. However, for Badiou, he posits the natural multiple only as one form of consistency among other types of multiples. And so, of course, he gets into what actually rigorously constitutes the natural. And then we get this in 108 to 109. No, I'm sorry, that's the wrong page. We get this in the last page of the chapter. The natural for Badiou entails that every set be normal and that every set belong to it also be normal. And so what this means is that for every set beneath, it must also be included and it must also belong. So that, and we'll get this later with ordinals, that a natural consistency is such of pure total presentation and total representation. Every set that is normal, every set below it also is presented and belongs, or I'm sorry, is included and belongs, and then every set below that, so that we have unending natural multiples. So this gives a rigorous concept to the Heideggerian notion of physis, to the notion of nature, but as we'll see later, this nature is not unassailable, and in fact there are cracks and fissures throughout, which doesn't manifest itself entirely in this section, but we'll get it much, much clearer in the next half of the book on event. So, yes.
How does that compare to his read of Spinoza and Spinoza's conception of nature? Is it the same or is it different?
Well, it's different because Heidegger is not trying to...
I'm not saying Heidegger's conception of nature, I'm saying the way Badiou formally analyzes nature as, in its pure normality.
I think he's, as I read him, he's saying Spinoza has more or less figured it out, except that he doesn't mathematize. But he has figured out the structure, if you will, of nature. The problem is that Spinoza believes is nature with a capital N. So, and that's why he's Badiou's counterbot, right? Who's got the same basic structure of looking at being, but actually believes there is nature with a capital N.
Well, and also, just going along with that, right? The natural multiple is not the totality of all multiples, right? Which is an important distinction. For Spinoza, nature is all, right? Everything is naturalized in total presentation and total representation.
Everything belongs.
Right.
No inclusion.
Yeah.
All belonging.
And if you recall, that's what his criticism against Spinoza is there's no bridging the gap between the finite and the infinite. And the reason why is there's no outside of nature. Right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. Also, it's that...
There's no proper name of the void in Spinoza.
Yeah, well, it becomes the infinite mode. But also, what he attempts to do is posit the one as causality, which then becomes substance or God. And so what happens is that the finite, which would in other systems only be a representation, now is sort of, again, it's an attempt to make infinite normality, infinite presentation in the one, right? All belongs to God, right? All is the single substance, but then also having our finite representation of existence.
Right.
And so, yeah, so this cut can't be overcome. Any interjections there?
I think that works, yeah.
But again, this is the big difference with Badiou, is the multiple, the natural multiple is one multiple among many.
That's the crucial. It's always natural with a lowercase n.
Right.
For Badiou.
And then, as we'll see later in his rejection of the one, right, the O multiple, is it's not even possible to have a totality of nature, right? So this is another reason why it's a lowercase n instead of a capital N. Is that, I mean, of course we'll get to that. Are there any other questions or points to be brought up in this section? Or?
Ontic versus ontological. I'm foolish and I don't know the difference, really.
So, for Heidegger and many philosophers after Heidegger, they take this sort of difference. The ontological, roughly speaking, well, let me say this. If you want to know the difference between ontic and ontological, read Being and Time. But roughly speaking, ontic is the world. This is difficult because I don't want to abuse the term phenomenon. But the world as it appears to us, a world of beings, whereas the ontological is the very grounds for the possibility of being, of ecstasis, right, existence, which is being as such.
That's the simple way to say this, that for Heidegger there's a play between being with a capital B, if you will, where we're talking about a verb in the infinitive, and beings, which are objects, experientiable objects. And it's the play between those two. Ontological is ever pertaining to being, the verb, whereas to deal ontically with things is to deal with objects.
Okay. Right. To try and put it into Badiou's terminology, because that's what we're doing, is the ontological would be the mathemes, right, the pure multiple, but the ontic would be the applied multiple. So, for example, the ontological is set theory, right, because it's a theory of pure multiple, whereas an ontic could be, an ontic multiple would be the set of people in this room, which becomes a determinate concrete being.
Would it be the situation versus the structure?
No.
Not quite.
Because the situation and the structure both appear in ontology, but the way in which they appear is as pure presentation as such.
Badiou would say that the ontological is what he would call ontological, but the ontic would be what he calls logic. It's a question of appearance, it's a question of experience, if you will. So, but that's what Logics of Worlds is about. He's working through his whole ontic theory, if you will.
So would you say that the ontic then is the application and creation of axioms, then?
That's incredibly vague, and there's no way for me to answer that. What I am going to say is this. If it is a pure multiple, which is to say mathematical and only derived, its only object is the void, or rather the name of the void, then it's ontological for Badiou. If it has something else, and whatever that something is, that is not the name of the void, and it is an actual something, because it's important to note, right, he asserts, and he points out the necessary assertion of the axiom of infinity, but he notes this is not the assertion of an existence of something new, and is all derivative from the name of the void, right? So if it only has the name of the void, if it is pure mathematics as such, if it is the pure presentation of the multiple, the presentation of presentation, then it is ontological. If it is